as much as we have begun having rising numbers when it comes to the COVID, there is a conversation on all the monies that we're asking for to solve the problem. Exactly where is it going to come from? And even if it's a loan, one day we're going to be paying back. Revenue should also be one of the things that we're thinking about. And so if revenue is leaking elsewhere, we've got to make sure that we plug the holes right now, that we're actually also looking for money. One of the places that the finance minister was proposing that we take a look at when it comes to oil and gas sector is actually the Heritage Fund. But why dip your hand in a sovereign wealth fund, which is supposed to be slated for the future? And so we're here to have a discussion on the oil sector, the mining sector, the extractive sector, and really how we can drill down on drawing a lot of revenue whilst we are really cash strapped in these times. I'm here with Dr. Steve Mantel. He is actually the co-chair for Gaiety. Well, Doctor, you know that this was a major campaign promise, and we're in election 2020. This may not be the time, for example, for them to want to cut out free SHS, but should we go back to the drawing board after 2020 to say that, look, having looked at our budgetary overruns, deficits that have come as a result of COVID, and we not wanting to lose the gains that were made in terms of macroeconomic fundamentals, can we take a look at this policy again?
Yes, I think we should. And let me make the point that I perfectly understand what the government is trying to achieve with free SHS, and it's for good reasons. What we're trying to do is to democratize access to education, which is good. But in doing that, we are trying to use the equality principle to achieve equity. This is not done. The problem on our hands is one of inequity or inequitable access to education, where only the rich and those who can afford are able to access secondary education in this country. So we want to address that.
Yeah.
The way you address that is to use, what do you call it? Equitable instruments, or instruments that achieves equity, by discriminating in terms of who benefits from free SHS. The argument has been made that how do you define the poor in this country? That's a difficulty. And that is why, because we cannot target the poor, we need to actually have a blanket social intervention for all, including those who are filthy rich and can afford to pay for their children. Yes. Now, my advice or my response to this is that there is a very simple, fundamental way of targeting the poor with free SHS in this country that can save money to do other things to enhance our developmental efforts. And it is this: free SHS must be available only to children who pass through the public school system, what we call the CITO. And you find that all those who can afford to pay international school fees, okay, can afford to pay secondary school because it's less. Yeah. And again, you find that the very poor, who whether they want or not cannot afford international schools but have to send their children to the public school, will be the beneficiaries of free SHS. That will save us some money. Now, we missed out on some of these suggestions because the opportunity was not created to harness views and ideas from the general populace. I recall that anybody who spoke or had some advice for the free SHS was immediately classified as being an opponent of this good initiative. Yeah. So in that process, trying to politicize the implementation, we lost out on a lot of good advice. I'm pretty sure there are others who also have very useful advice in terms of how we efficiently manage this and make the free SHS sustainable. For me, sustainability is an issue. Yeah. This initiative will not have a future if we don't have a cross-party buy-in. The MPP government will not remain in power forever. So in the event of having an NDC government, what happens to the free SHS? I'm pretty sure Ghanaians and the government that is implementing the free SHS would want the initiative to stay. If we all want it to stay, then this is the time to begin brainstorming in terms of the financing arrangement. What kinds of financing arrangement will make the initiative sustainable? For now, relying on petroleum revenues make it highly precarious. Today, we have a revenue shortfall in the petroleum sector of up to about 6 billion Ghana cedis. This is not good news for free SHS. Petroleum prices have actually declined from around $70 per barrel to about $20 per barrel. This is a huge fall in expected revenue.
Currently at $32.
Well, good, but it's still very low. And therefore, how then do you make up for the budgetary shortfall in terms of financing the free SHS?
That's right.
So we need to really brainstorm on how we diversify funding for this laudable initiative.
But it's still staying on revenue generation, and you mentioned the fact that the mining sector, which will be one of the sectors that will be really benefiting from the current situation, should be one of the places we should be targeting at. Probably increasing taxation or finding means of taking some other revenue to cushion what is currently happening. Will that mean that we find a proper way of getting our carried interest, our 10% carried interest, like we have done in the oil sector, from the mining sector in a proper way? And what regulation should be changed towards this?
Well, it's a balancing act. You cannot kill the hen that lays the golden eggs, and you deprive yourself of future eggs. And so we need to do things in a way that does not kill the mining industry. Even while we try to find money within the mining sector, we need to also think about their own sustainability. In the past decade or so, we've undertaken major fiscal policy reforms in the mining sector. I'm not too sure what the impact has been on their operations, positive or negative. I think that study ought to be undertaken. I'm also not too sure what the impact has been on government revenue. Again, that study ought to be undertaken to inform future policy going forward. But I made the point that we have had to vary the royalty rate, which used to be a range of 3 to 6%, to a fixed rate of 5%. This means more revenue to the state. We've had to increase corporate income tax from 25% to 35%. Again, more revenue for the state. Sometime in 2015, we took a decision recognizing that we're losing out on the time value of money by requiring mining companies to pay their royalty on quarterly basis. So they hold on to our money for 3 months. If we were to buy treasury bills with this money, you can imagine how much money you can make on these hundreds of millions of dollars. So we decided through a policy decision, which was announced by the Minister of Finance then, I think in the 2015 budget, that henceforth mining companies were going to pay their royalties on monthly basis.
But this was not enacted in a law.
Exactly. The necessary amendment to statute that will give effect to this policy decision was never done. And even as we speak, it's not been done. Which speaks of how sometimes careless we can be as a people, and therefore losing a lot of revenue. Look, if you were to amend the law to give effect to this policy decision, what it means is that you can have, your cash flow will improve. So you have money coming almost monthly, and helps you to deal with emergencies like we're finding now. I understand what the GRA has done in the absence of the legislative backing to this policy decision, is to require just engage the companies and use moral suasion to get them to agree to pay monthly. I'm aware Newmont, for instance, is paying monthly, but I'm not too sure that all of them are paying monthly. And those who are not paying monthly are right, because the law says they should pay quarterly. There's been no change in the act.
Doctor, you've still not dealt with my issue of taking a look at our carried interest in the mining sector. Is this something we should take a relook, because it is only when people declare dividend, out of which 10% is given to us as a country. Should we rather not be looking at what has been achieved in the oil sector, or from scratch putting our 10% foot out and saying that we are part of the production and so we should have that kind of revenue?
Right. Most of the fiscal reforms that I talk about have been brought about by the Ghana EITI. Every year, every now and then, as we produce our reports, we do make policy recommendations, and we engage the key stakeholders, including government, to ensure that we implement these policy recommendations. The most recent policy recommendation that has been made by the Ghana EITI is indeed has to do with the 10% free carried interest in all mining concessions, which, according to the EITI report, haven't counted for much in terms of revenue to the state. Right. Because the only times when we've gotten something out of this 10% carried interest have been those moments when companies have declared dividends. And you know, the declaration of dividends is not automatic. Mm-hmm. And so if the boardroom decides that, look, we're not going to pay our dividends this year, that's it. We don't get it. And so it so happens that there's been lots of companies that haven't declared dividends for a very long time, and therefore it appears that our 10% interest in those concessions or those contracts haven't really yielded anything for us. The Ghana EITI is looking at various policy options. One of them, for instance, would be to treat our 10% carried interest as equity, in the same way that we do in the oil sector. So, for instance, we would take our 10% in kind, which will be a share of production. That is one way we want to look at it. Let me make the point that, indeed, in the mining sector, we collect our royalty and all the fiscals in cash, even though the law allows us to collect them in kind. And this is also something we need to look at, because the gold that is produced belongs to you. You don't take your share of the production. You allow the companies to go sell, come and tell you how much they got for the output, what they sold, and then pay you your share in cash. That hasn't been really helpful. The oil sector, what we do is that we don't collect the cash. We collect our share of production, sell it ourselves, and then decide on what to do with the money. So all these are policy considerations currently on the table. We're working on a policy paper, which when finalized, there's a draft now, but when finalized, the Ghana EITI will be engaging the economic management team, the Ministry of Finance, and other key stakeholders to see how we can ensure that our 10% carried interest in mining concessions count for some revenue to help us deal with some of the fiscal challenges that confront us as a country.
There's also a regulation from the mining sector that takes a look at companies investing 500 million and above get to have a certain special concession, and for which others that don't fall in that category have a different dispensation when it comes to the 5% royalties. Exactly how should we be treating this? Because then if companies decide to make more inputs, how does that concern us as a country in any way? I decide to expand my company, and then that becomes even an incentive for expansion. Shouldn't that rather attract more taxes from me? And so this whole discussion when it comes to that part of the regulation, I'm not getting properly, and shouldn't this be one of the things we should also be looking at?
Yeah, we should be looking at it. This relates to our Minerals and Mining Act 703 of 2006, which actually provides that if any company invests half a billion or more in its projects, it becomes entitled to what we call development agreement. And within this development agreement, we have what we call stability agreements. Now, the effect of stability agreements really is to freeze your fiscal loss, so that in the event of you having to do any fiscal reforms to the extent that those fiscal reforms will negatively impact on the company, they exempted. So it became more like a one-way street, that if you pass new tax laws, and these new tax laws will be at the disadvantage of a company, which means they will be taxing the companies more. The company that has stability agreement with the government is exempted. But if you were to lower your tax laws, they can take advantage. So anything that goes to their disadvantage, they exempted. But it will inure to their advantage, they can take advantage of it. And that, in my view, was treating those agreements as a one-way street, and did not ensure that in the event of commodity boom, right, the country is able to derive commensurate profits. As a result of the Ghana EITI recommendations, there was a decision to take another look at the stability agreements with the two major companies that had them, Newmont and Anglo Gold Ashanti. And now the way they've been amended makes it more like a two-way street, and they are tied more to the prevailing market conditions. So if the market conditions change, of course we can initiate renegotiations to ensure that we're able to obtain commensurate benefits from the boom. And so that is one way in which we are making some progress. While just about the time when the Newmont and the Anglo Gold thing was concluded, then you had Goldfields also pushing for a development agreement. So according to them, cumulatively, when they look at their investments, they've exceeded the $500 million mark, and therefore they are entitled to development agreement. Now, there's a certain lack of clarity in terms of the position of the law, and this lack of clarity is further reinforced by the fact that for a very long time we didn't have regulations to the Act, and therefore it's been subjected to varied interpretation. First and foremost is we are not too sure whether the $500 million required for a development agreement is to be taken into account at the point of the investment. So you don't do piecemeal investment, but you come and say, this is my money, perhaps kept in an escrow account, and then we monitor its use. There wasn't such arrangements in terms of how to ensure that companies do these investments. And so you have a situation where a company can come to you, may have been in operations for 50 years, and begin to say, hey, over the time I've been here, cumulatively this is what I have invested, so give me a development agreement. So we need some more clarity on that. I recall some members of the Ghana negotiating team were highly incensed by the fact that we gave in so easily to Goldfields. And in the process, a paper I read authored by Professor Akila Kwasoya on this matter, I think estimated that we may be losing some $25 million annually in the Goldfield Development Agreement alone, based on the fact that we did not take our time to go through it properly.
I want to find out, it looks like the system we chose in relation to the oil sector gives us a lot of room to find the loopholes and to plug them. And I'll say that one of them is the discussion on GMPC and a loan that was taken from GMPC, $50 million, for which till today government hasn't paid. In 2018, the finance minister said, look, we're supposed to be having a cap. And once we drew the cap to some 25%, that loan makes up for the cap that we have put on revenues that is supposed to come to you. So it no longer becomes a loan. How does GMPC develop if things like this continue to happen? And where are we with this kind of discussion?
I think the case of GMPC is particularly sad, and I believe we need a national conversation on the GMPC we want as a people, and that should inform the kind of governance regime we put in place at GMPC. But I believe, even before the conversation begins, that most Ghanaians would want a GMPC that is able to fend for itself and return some dividends to the state. And GNPC will not be the first company, nationally owned company, that will be paying dividends to the state. That we've heard about Daily Graphic sometimes paying dividends to the state. We have SIC, we have Goyle and other enterprises, GCB. These are all state-owned enterprises that do not depend on the budget.
That's right.
They go fend for themselves and return some dividends to the state. So going forward, I think that is the way we should be looking at GNPC.
But the whole conversation, this conversation is supposed to come into full flesh by 2026. GNPC is supposed to be on its own by 2026. And so someone will say, why are we in a hurry to jump the gun when this is already supposed to be there? My concern is this loan should be paid back.
Wow. Who is the owner of GNPC?
Government.
And who took the money?
Government.
So that's it. And so until we get to the point where we treat GNPC purely as a commercial entity and find ways of insulating GNPC's management from governmental interference, we'll have to, I'm afraid, live with this. Properly speaking, I do not think that GNPC chief executive and top management should be appointed by the political authority. The same way the management of other state-owned enterprises are not directly appointed by the president. For instance, if you look at Graphic, the CEO of Graphic is appointed by the Media Commission and not by the president per se. And so we can learn from those type of arrangements and try to insulate. So for instance, whoever becomes the CEO of GNPC should be appointed through the Public Services Commission, given security of tenure and adequate insulation from governmental interference, and give him some standards or benchmarks, key performance indicators to meet, and that way it will be emboldened. He'll be emboldened to ensure that decisions that are taken are purely in line with business considerations. For now, we haven't come to that yet, so you can expect a lot of governmental interference and wastefulness in the way GNPC's affairs are managed.
Let me read this, and this was a PIAC report, I think 2017-2018. It says the 2019 semi-annual report for the Public Interest and Accountability Committee cited Tallow of having made a lodgement of $75 million into the account of the GRA instead of lodging the said amount to the Petroleum Holding Fund. What did this do to the Petroleum Holding Fund? Obviously, the money wasn't in there, but what does this mean?
What it means is that the monies that were mistakenly lodged in the GRA account would have formed part of the government's money, and therefore the share that goes through the budget, the annual budget funding amount. Because it wasn't paid into the Petroleum Holding Fund, but the GRA account, meant that for that period, government was deprived of access to this money for its development programs. For me, what was worrying about this development was not the fact that this mistake was made, but how it was treated when it was detected. But I recall that in some meetings with the GRA actually conceded that some error has been made, and that's this money, $75 million paid into their account. But then their problem was that they don't know how to reverse the transaction. And that for me was quite frightening, that monies have been mistakenly paid into your account, but you don't know how to refund the money back to where it should go. And so
that's strange.
Yeah, it was to me too. But subsequently, following several engagement with GRA, eventually they managed to return the money, but they returned it without interest. So if this money had been invested, of course, we'd have gotten some interest out of it. But we understand that, well, it's state-to-state transaction, so we can overlook that for now. But going forward, we want to ensure that mechanisms are put in place to forestall a reoccurrence of this type of mislodgement. It's happened before, and I think this is the second or third time it's happening. GRA has given assurance that they will be constantly orienting the relevant desk officers at the IOCs, the international oil companies, so that they know where to pay what type of tax.
PIAC, even though they haven't had a prosecutory role all these years, have made a lot of inputs, and a lot of reforms have come as a result of some of the reports that have come out. Is it time for us to have a singular body that takes a look at mining and takes a look at the oil and gas sector, and possibly even the whole extractive sector, a body that has a supervisory role, prosecutory role, so that we really benefit from the revenues that come out of the extractive sector?
Yeah, that discussion is currently ongoing, and there have been some work done, led by the Honorable Deputy Minister for Finance, Honorable Kwekukwat. I think he's in charge of revenue at the ministry, and Honorable Mohammed Amin Adam, Deputy Minister for Energy, in charge of petroleum, and also the Ministry for Lands and Natural Resources. And in the various meetings, they have been represented by the technical advisor to the minister, Mr. Ayi, who used to be the CEO of the Minerals Commission some years back. Yeah, and so some work has been done. I happen to have been part of a small team that was created to craft such a legislation. So there is a draft bill which has been handed over to the ministries, the 3 ministries, to review and take them through the necessary processes.
So specifically, what does this draft bill say, or what does it address?
Well, basically, it is seeking to create a harmonized nomenclature for dealing with the transparency and accountability issues in both mining and oil, which means it may end up repealing the Public Interest and Accountability Committee from the Petroleum Revenue Management Act, and then recreating it under this new bill, and then giving it, the new PIAC, if you want to call it, an expanded mandate to ensure transparency and accountability in both oil and mining sectors.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And Dr. Steve Montiel is the Vice Chair for GATE, that's been looking at the mining sector and some of the things that need to be done and reforms that have to go on for us to maximize on revenues and all other issues. Well, we've been taking a look at, after COVID-19 and everything settles, the need for us as a country to take a look at our free SHS program, the need for us to quickly take a look at having one statutory body that takes a look at the oil and gas sector and also the mining sector, and indeed some nitty-gritties and some ironing out that has to be done in the various PIAC reports that haven't been done to generate more revenue for this country. My name is Odile Ntiamwa.